In our text this morning, Jesus is in a party mood, so let the party begin. But before we can get to Luke 14, we have to put this party in context, because this is really just the prelude to the big party, the centerpiece of Luke, when we get to the next chapter, Luke 15. In the next chapter, Jesus is going to regale us with no less than 3 parties. There was the first party, remember, in Luke 15 of the shepherd who had 100 sheep, but he comes home with only 99. So he goes out to find the lost one. He finds it. There's a party. There's a woman who had 10 coins. She can only find 9. After she finds that 10th coin, she throws a party. And then those 2 parties lead to the biggest bash of all, the great homecoming party that is thrown for the lost boy, the prodigal son. Prodigal, you remember, of course, is an adjective that means wild, wasteful. So a prodigal son is a wild, wasteful son. He wastes all of his inheritance partying, only to come home to find that the father is more prodigal in party planning than even the prodigal son. We'll get to those parties after Christmas. But before Jesus gets to those parties, which are all about the lost, we get to today enjoy the party of Luke 14. Because this is a party for a person who is neither lost nor a loser. For reasons we're not told, Jesus is invited to a dinner party of a prominent Pharisee. And for reasons we're not told, Jesus accepts the invitation to dine with a prominent Pharisee. This is not going to be a nachos and beer kind of party while we watch a football game. It is the home of a prominent Pharisee on the Sabbath. Now, in order that you might hear this text in all of its original glorious shock, permit me to set the scene with some artistic license. And of course, you know me well enough that I always do this, never, ever, of course, to mock the text or the story or demean it. No, conversely, my fear is that we have sanitized the English so much, and we live so far removed from the first century culture and context that we can just skim over this passage and not see the scandal. So let me point out the scandal. So scandalous that Luke feels inclined to include it in his gospel. So it's a Friday night, which is the beginning of the Jewish Sabbath, the holiest day of the week. It's a prominent Pharisees. Pharisees, remember, were the religious teachers. These are the seminary professors. And the prominent one of all of them is the one throwing the party. This is the president of a seminary. And this must be a prominent one, then, a president of a seminary, for a party on a Sunday, a dinner party. This has got to be a sit-down dinner for 12, around a dining room table as long as a bowling alley, floating above it a crystal chandelier. And the guests that would be invited on the Sabbath to the home of a prominent Pharisee, they must have been all the glitterati of Jerusalem and of the temple. Important, successful, beautiful people. I mean, a table full of Christian Reform people. They've all put on fresh robes for this party. They've cleaned off their sandals. They've dabbed their faces with olive oil to perk up their complexion. They're ready for a dinner party and the meal. They arrive and there's Russian beluga caviar served with a montrachet as an appetizer as guests mingle. Wagyu beef for the entree served with the Romanée Conti. You get the idea. This is a prominent home on the holiest day of the week. You are out to impress. And Jesus, our Jesus, somehow gets invited and is sitting in the middle of all of it. The evening begins with proper, polite chit-chat about the Jerusalem weather. Others wonder why the stock of sheep has taken a plunge this week. Others are commenting on the beautiful new stylish sandals worn by Mrs. Prominent Pharisee. Jesus finds himself at the dinner table making polite conversation with his table mate. He starts talking about his soreness and how he's aging and his body has, been so sore. And Luke, being the doctor, lets us know that he's suffering from dropsy, but in Luke's language, he says, hudropkis. Hudropkis is when water swells in your body, and where it swells, then there's terrible pain. At the same time, you become thirsty, so you drink more, but that only adds to the swelling. So we can imagine Jesus kind of rolling his eyes as his table mate is talking about his ill health and his swollen feet and how sore they were. Walking didn't seem to help. So he calls to the waiter for another drink. And he says, lately my shoulder has been out of whack, and, that makes me think about my back is sore too. Where's the waiter with my drink? Come on. Jesus hears it all. Got the scene? And then without warning, at this dinner party, Jesus stands up and chimes his champagne flute with a fork. And everybody has his attention. Good evening, everybody here. I just met my new friend, Winston. He's complaining that his feet and shoulders and back are sore. Shall we heal him? And there are gasps and glances around the table. The string quartet stops mid-cadence. Even the waiters stop and the serving staff wondering what they're supposed to do next. The hostess, Mrs. Prominent Pharisee, clutches her brooch and says something like, "Well, I never," as she whispers to her husband, "I told you we shouldn't invite him." And before anybody can stop Jesus, he's pushing away the plates of Wagyu beef. He's sliding over the centerpiece of roses and hoisting old Winston, tucks patent leather shoes and all up onto the table. I tell you, the Pharisees had never seen anything like it. Jesus is now up on the table. Winston is up on the table. Jesus has Winston's sandals off and he's starting to massage those dropsied, swollen feet. By this time, the hostess has fainted, and the prominent Pharisee has turned as red in anger as his Merlot. I told you I was going to need some artistic license, but you need to see it. Do you see it now? I'll pull back. But what I'm trying to get us to see is that Jesus healing someone at the home of a prominent Pharisee during a dinner party on the Sabbath, that's not just some throwaway line to introduce a story. This was a violation of civility, of decency. It simply wasn't done, healing during a dinner party. And then a dinner party not even at your home, but at somebody else's home on a Sabbath. Certainly not the behavior of a true Messiah, you see. And the other crazy thing about this story is that the beginning of our text makes it clear that this is not a parable. By that I mean, so far in Luke, we would expect Jesus, if he wants to make a point about healing on the Sabbath, most of the time, he would have started by teaching with the parable. Once there was a man who had a dinner party on the Sabbath. No. This is not a parable. Jesus is the parable. He's really the actor doing the miracle on the Sabbath during a dinner party. And everyone is mortified. Did you catch Luke, verse 4? Certainly written with a grin. They all remained silent. You think? You see, what alarms them most is that among them is the presence of a religious professor, a rabbi, who doesn't give a hoot about public manners or mismanners. Because now Jesus confirms it. No sooner is he done strapping on Winston's sandals, for the sandals now fit, the dropsy is healed. As I see it, Jesus gets Winston back on his feet. They slide the centerpiece back to the middle of the table. The waiter finally arrives with Winston's glass of water. Nobody is saying anything. So now that Jesus has their attention, he says in effect, "And you guys call this snoozeville of an affair a party? Look, Winston here was in pain. His feet were swollen, which made his knees hurt, which threw his back out. How was he going to dance when the string quartet started up with a waltz? Wouldn't any of you have done the same things if it wasn't Winston, but your child or an ox that fell into a well and was asking you for help?" Luke, still smiling, verse 6 says, "They had nothing to say." So while he has the mic, Jesus goes on, looking around the table, and he says, and by the way, people, as I watched you come into this party, I watched how all of you jockeyed for the best places next to the prominent Pharisee and his wife. But religious professors, what if somebody had arrived with a more impressive resume, somebody who maybe published more books than you? You know what? You would be embarrassed because the president would have to move you down to make room for the more illustrious guest. You didn't ask, but let me tell you, the best strategy for us here is to choose the worst seat. That way, you might be asked to move up. That's what you want, rather than to be asked to move down. For everyone who is exalted will be humbled, and everyone who is humbled will be exalted. Shocking statement number 2 at the dinner party. Humility is the new way to get ahead. They had worked hard to manipulate themselves to get the best seats by being prominent, successful, published, tenured. Jesus looks at them and sort of says, "But can you do humility?" I remember one of my first true doses of humility. It was my undergraduate years at my college. My school had something called a job board, and it was right outside the cafeteria. So as you were queuing up to get your lunch or dinner, you would always file by this chalkboard that business owners had called in and said, "We need temp help or long-term help on this chalkboard." People were always looking for youthful, energetic, young college students. So I was having dinner one night with my cousin Lori, who happened to go to the same college. We were standing in line and we were looking at all the new entries, and there, put up on chalk that day, the Amway Grand Plaza Hotel seeks staff, competitive wages, uniforms included. And my cousin and I looked at each other and we said, "Wow, do you know how good we would look standing in front of the Amway Grand Plaza in a red tuxedo with gold braiding, wearing white gloves? Imagine the tips. Let's do this." We applied. We got the job. We were called down to the tailor shop. They took all of our measurements, and he scheduled our first shift with our supervisor after he said their uniforms will be ready. We came back the next week. We were handed our uniforms. We went to our locker rooms to change. I opened up my garment bag, and there in my garment bag was not a red tuxedo, but something that looked like surgical scrubs, except they were the color of mud. And I went out and I said, "What's this?" And they said, "Well, that's your uniform. You will be starting out by taking down conference room tables and chairs and then setting up rooms for the next event." And with that, he showed us the way to the storage room full of tables and chairs. I did the work, and during that time, I learned what true humility was. And conversely, I also developed a proverb of my own. If you want to know who people really are, watch how they treat people who work in hotels. wearing uniforms the color of mud. My daughter, Libby, worked for a summer in Grand Rapids as a cashier at Whole Foods. It was so rare when somebody smiled at her or said thank you or even asked her how her day was going. It was so rare that when it did happen, it was news to phone home with. How do I treat people who don't particularly mean much to me or my welfare or to my mission that day? Jesus is saying, if you want to get ahead, forget your social rules, or try adding this to your list of rules. But can you do humility? Well, it's clear by now that Jesus has not only taken over the dinner party, but the evening, and the hosts have completely lost control. And if there's one thing that Pharisees feared, it was losing control. Jesus must have sensed this too. So now Jesus, being our Jesus, goes on. He says the third shocking statement. He looks at the prominent Pharisee and Mrs. Prominent Pharisee and says, look, I'm just here to save the lost, and I've come to raise the dead. And so he suggests that the next time they think about planning a party, and if they really want to have a good time, they ought to consider not just inviting this crowd of healthy, well-heeled, stuffed shirts, but they ought to think about inviting the blind, the lame, the maimed, the poor, the ones who've never seen such a dinner party, the ones who would never even dare dream that they would be invited to such a party. Scene 1, Jesus on the table working out Winston's dropsy. Scene 2, Jesus inviting everybody at the party for the way they chose their seats. Scene 3, Jesus tears into the host by suggesting they ought to go instead think about inviting all the losers in town. Don't you just love our Jesus all over again? Jesus is at the table of all those who made it, those who are certain they have the right ticket. People who think that a fun evening consists of measured, polite conversation. People who will regale their dinner guests with stories of how they've clawed their way to the top of the heap by their one-upmanship. People like us. People who were born and raised on the notion that, you know what, your life has to be about winning. Your life is about self. Life is about getting to the head of the class and staying there. Life is about fifth row center, getting the best seats in the house. And at the end of it all, to be able to stand at the top of the heap. And then Jesus shows up at our party and asks, but can you do humility? And he says, think about it this way. When you give a party, don't invite those who will simply reciprocate. I mean, what fun is that? Invite the ones who least expect an invitation and imagine their surprise when they open the envelope. And then Jesus says to the host, and don't worry about repayment, because I, Jesus, am here to tell you that you'll get paid fully at the resurrection. And with that, Jesus delivers the final blow. Jesus attacks the notion of giving a party as a means of getting. What's the point of keeping score when God isn't? The gospel writer John famously wrote that God so loved the world that he sent his son to die for the world. Luke puts it another way. God so loved the world that God sent his son into the world to throw a party and to invite everyone. To invite the last, lost, least, and did you catch the sign off? And even to invite the dead. A party for the dead? Jesus says, oh yes, as he concludes, one day soon and very soon, in fact, I'm going to throw the largest, most outrageous dinner party of all times, and we're going to call it the resurrection. Way better than your slow leak dinner parties. So loosen up, get ready for it, let go, chill out, get some wine, unwind, get down, and invite everybody you know. And friends, when we get to that party, don't worry if your seat is not at the head table, but at table 20. Because I'm telling you, all the way down at table 20, that's most likely where you'll be seated next to Jesus. Amen.